to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham. We're coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, where the Pierre Savard Conference just ended. And we were inundated this year with people from Western University. It was really just an overflow of people from London who were here. And there was actually a really strong contingent of people doing history of the First World War. And if you've been following the site in the past couple of weeks, we've had stuff from York University. The history department there did some videos commemorating the First World War. So we thought we'd do a podcast to sort of work in conjunction with those videos. So we have three members of the Western contingent with us today to talk about different aspects of the First World War. First, we have Renaissance man Ryan Flavelle. Very the bilingual one of the group. He's just been showing off for us. It's very impressive. Jordan Chase and Jeremy Garrett, all three of you gentlemen are PhD candidates down at Western. I guess my first question before we get into the real content of the First World War is Western has a very strong contingent of military historians. And I'm just wondering, why are people so drawn to Western military history? Is it as simple as Jonathan Vance is there? Or is there a deeper connection to military history around the history department there? And that's open to anybody.
It's Jonathan Vance. At least for me. I don't know. I can't speak to anybody else in the program, but the reason that I'm a Western, I did military history in Calgary before this, but I went to Western specifically to study with Jonathan Vance. So.
Yes, I would tend to agree with Ryan. The reason why I initially chose to come to Western was simply because Professor Jonathan Vance was there, and I was strongly encouraged by my previous supervisor that would be a great avenue to go down. But aside from that, once I actually came to London, I realized that the resources of the university are outstanding regarding Canadian military history. And not only that, London itself has a lot of great military tradition. The Royal Canadian Regiment is right there. So it was really a good spot to not only study it, but also to work with particular experts in the field.
Well, I'm not sure if I need to add my voice to this because it's we go along the exact same lines. When I was an employee at the Director of History and Heritage, the director there, Steve Harris, actually strongly suggested that I go work with Professor Jonathan Vance, more because the topic I wanted to look at, burial policy, looked at both the First World War but also the social memory aspect of it, which for Professor Jonathan Vance was his specialty. So strongly suggested that I go down there, and I'm glad I did.
Well, I mean, you forget to add that you abandoned this particular university to do so.
Well, I wasn't staying here for all 3 degrees.
I believe the phrase used was "drop it like a bad penny."
You got to know when to abandon a sinking ship. That's another way of putting it, perhaps.
All right, there we go. Thanks for coming, guys. It's been a lot of fun.
It's been great.
Yeah,
Thanks
it's been
for
a good
having
show.
us.
Yeah. So, you guys each presented yesterday. The conference is actually over right now. We're recording this just after the final panel. You guys each presented yesterday. We're going to kind of take this a little bit in a somewhat of to me, what is a logical order. But anyone feel free to chime in as we ask these questions. So we're going to start with Ryan. Your presentation was on the remittance men of Northern Alberta.
Southern Alberta.
Southern Alberta, excuse me, who enlisted in the First World War. And first of all, just could you explain who those guys were?
Well, before I even go any further, the concept of remittance men is a very difficult one to narrow down within the actual documentation of the historiography. No, it's a simple enough concept. Remittance men were people from Britain, overwhelmingly England, although I did find a couple examples of gentry in Northern Ireland, actually, but who for one reason or another, overwhelmingly that reason was drunkenness, left England under a cloud of discontent, kicked out by their families, usually how it's given, and sent to the colonies, be it Australia or Canada. Those are the 2 big destinations. South Africa, to a lesser extent, after the end of the Boer War. And, of course, the Boer War plays a role in all of this. But came to Canada, in this case, the Northwest, which was just being opened, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, and were told essentially to stay there and given a remittance to do so. Usually they were given cash up front, so a fairly large amount of capital numbers ranged that I came across from like £100 to £10,000, somewhere in that as upfront capital to get them started, and then they would receive a remittance after that. It becomes problematic because the reason that people were classed as remittance men was simply because they didn't fit in. Usually they lost all their money. Usually they were drunken wastrels. If they came to Alberta and got their act together and had a going concern and built an effective ranch, generally speaking, they weren't referred to as remittance men. So they sort of fall out of that category. So it's not like an actual category of people, although there were a very large number of them, especially in the period, like the general period from about 1885, the completion of the CPR, to outbreak of the First World War, is the usual period given, but especially around the turn of the century, that sort of 1900 to 1910 is when it's most popular. And why I chose to focus on Southern Alberta, other than the fact that I'm from Southern Alberta, so it's it's pretty it's good to do local history because you know the area that much better. But a lot of them, the life of the rancher appealed to them. Like, why would you want to be a dirt farmer in Saskatchewan when you could ride horses around on the plains of Southern Alberta, right? And so my research for this paper sought to inquire whether or not they actually all died in the First World War. That's what I wanted to find out. Whether the war broke out, they all went to the war, and they all died. And what I found was that, first of all, it's hard to track these guys because usually their actual names weren't given in the various accounts, and there's a lot of accounts as to who these people were and a lot of anecdotes that get promulgated. But very seldom do you get a full Christian name out of those accounts. So I was able to track quite a few, maybe 20 to 30 in the Southern Alberta area, of various degree of remittance man, various degree of drunken wastrel, essentially. And I found that although it's true that quite a few did join, and some joined either the CEF, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, or the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, not as many died as you would think. Some returned, some didn't join at all, and that essentially what I argued in this presentation, in this paper, is that when the war ended, Canadians no longer needed remittance men to define themselves against. And that was the fundamental change in the reason that people stopped talking, because you can find evidence of British nobles in Alberta, in Southern Alberta, Calgary, right, all through the interwar period. But nobody really talks about it in the same context. Certainly there weren't as many of them, granted, but they did persist at least until the Second World War. But it was no longer a necessary component to explaining what life was like on the prairies, because you didn't need to define yourself against this English other like you once had to. The research is slightly more in depth than that, but that's a pretty decent overview, I think.
So if we get back then to the outbreak of the war, you make it sound like these guys have a pretty sweet deal out in Alberta.
Yeah,
they've gotten this capital, they've gotten this land. They're living a pretty good life, especially if they were living not such a great life in Europe.
Yeah.
Why would they enlist? What was the motivation of these guys to want to join either the Canadian forces or the British forces? Why would they give up this lifestyle?
Well, a couple things on that. One is the remittance could be as much a detriment as a benefit, right? Because you're getting money every month. You spend that money on booze, and you've got a dugout in the woods, which I gave a couple examples of that during the presentation. These guys were living pretty terrible lives, and moreover, they were unemployed. They lost their capital, and they were waiting for the checks to allow them to go out and buy the basic supplies that they needed for life, and usually that involved liquor, because these were a bunch of drunk guys. So when the war came, it offered them a way out of that. It would offer them a way out. A lot of them were unemployed. Essentially, if you were an employed remittance man, you weren't really a remittance man anymore, right? Okay. So if you fell into that sort of visible category of remittance man, then generally speaking, you were unemployed. Mm-hmm. And obviously, right, like the war breaks out, 60% of the first contingent, is that the number?
Might have even been a bit
higher. It might have even been a bit higher, but 60% of the first contingent is British-born. Mm-hmm. And the highest proportion of people who join are from the prairie provinces as a percentage of population. That's because so many immigrants live in the prairie provinces. And primarily it's almost socioeconomic, but you also can't remove the patriotic element from it. These are proud British citizens. They live by a code of ethics and of honor and action. So when war breaks, then they feel duty bound to go. And moreover, it offers them a chance to get back into British society, or at least that's the way that it's presented in the historiography. I think it's actually less so. Quite a few of them went back to Britain and went, nah, I'm okay, and then came back to Alberta after.
Okay, well then let me ask from the other way, is if I'm either the Canadian forces or the British forces, if these guys are drunks, why do I want them? Especially early on when there's this rush of volunteers.
Quite a few of them had military experience of one form or another. A lot of them knew how to ride. I mean, if you live on the like, polo was a big element in this. Sport was a big element. They loved to play sports. They loved to chase coyotes on their horses, like a fox hunt, except with a coyote. But actually, a lot of horses and a lot of people died that way because the horses would get trapped in the gopher holes, and break a leg and throw the rider and game over. So these are physically fit men. They're men, and as I say, they're men that sort of live by a code of honor and a code of ethics that's very upper crust British. Oh, I say, I know, deucedly unsporting. And those are the guys that really form the core. I mean, these are the guys. This is like Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, like people like that. That upper crust that sort of form the officer corps, the BEF. It's people like that in Canada that are going into the CF. And although I'd say it's about 50-50, guys who became officers versus guys that just enlisted. So there's not as high a percentage that are going in to become officers, but nevertheless, there's very strong motivation, and these are good troops. I mean, just because you like a dram of whiskey doesn't mean that you can't make a good soldier, right? Like,
no, but I guess if you can't hold down a job because you're drinking all the time, I mean, you got to wonder how trustworthy you could be at the front.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think that they were screened in that way. You know what I mean? Mm. It's hard to say exactly. I'm not sure if anybody else knows the answer to this, but it's hard to say whether when you went to a recruiting officer, they could go, "Oh, I know you. You're Joe Smith, and you're a bad apple. Get out of here." You know, I don't think that occurred.
If I could just jump in here, I would just say I think the military experience thing would necessarily override sort of the drunkenness or whatever sort of maybe social problems that they might had, because they're looking for experienced men to enlist. And the whole riding thing, if you know how to shoot, you know how to ride, that's already going to give you an advantage over many of the other applicants, regardless of perhaps maybe the social problems that you're experiencing.
Okay. And I would agree with that too. Now I'd also throw in the mentality of the small town mentality where everyone does know everyone, and that could play a role, but when you have people enlisting for patriotic causes, it might be overlooked. Okay, you're a bad apple, but this could be a way that you could, make up for that too.
Mm-hmm. That actually leads to something I was wondering, that the small town idea, is there a kinship amongst these guys that they sort of keep track of each other once they get over to Europe, and that they're maybe looking out for each other, trying to keep...
the problem is very few of these people left papers. I should say that right off the hop, and those that did are scanty, at least in the Southern Alberta example, are scanty on the actual what they did during the war. Most of the time, when you get accounts of remittance men, they're from before the war, and then there's the war part. You know what I mean? Which is completely separate, generally speaking. So, although they were intensely social people on the prairies, and remittance men tended to hang out together, they had training camps, and in at least one instance, I saw 3 of them join together. I don't know that they stuck together on the Western Front. It sounds like a really good story and like the makings of a really good book, but I haven't seen the evidence. I'm not saying that evidence isn't there. It wouldn't surprise me if they attempted to stick together on the Western Front, but I've seen no evidence to support that. So
okay, with that kinship before they go, though, is there a legacy that's left in Alberta of these guys, that even this romantic notion of here's this group of guys, sort of this free West attitude, who all band together and go off to war, does that leave a legacy in the communities in Southern Alberta?
Certainly, I think that the remittance men themselves left a legacy, but it's usually in the pre-war context that legacy is left. I mean, as far as like a literary legacy, Mark Zulka wrote Scoundrels, Dreamers, and Second Sons, which is pretty much the only published book on remittance men that I've come across, a recent scholarly published book. And he gives a couple examples of Albertans doing this. So in a sense, that's a legacy. In the interwar years, there's still a very strong affinity for British noblemen, like the Stampede Marshal. I can't remember the exact year off the top of my head, but the Stampede Marshal for 36, 37 is a full-on British earl who comes and moves to Alberta I've had a hard time isolating whether he was there before the war. In fact, I'm pretty sure he came after the war. I'm pretty sure he arrived in 1919. But nevertheless, the fascination with British nobility remains in Alberta, at least through the interwar years. And I mean, even to the present day, right? But I mean, as far as an actual physical legacy, in the long run, these people either became Albertan or they went back to Britain. You know, so did they influence what it was to become Albertan? Probably, but you know, they would eventually have integrated themselves fully into the community. You know what I mean?
Final question on this. I mean, do you have any ideas on survival numbers? How many of them lived? How many of them died? Or even how, I don't know if you can use the word successful, how successful they were as soldiers in the First World War?
Well, it's hard for me to give hard stats because there's so much ambiguity surrounding names, etc. I've called people remittance men that you could easily make the case aren't remittance men, and vice versa. I've excluded people from the group that may have been remittance men. And then as far as getting their records go, so they didn't join the CEF. Well, did they join the BEF? You know, so I don't have like an exact number of people that I can divide against. But of the people who I've found like CEF attestation papers for, I'd say it's somewhere in the order of about a third didn't come back, which is a higher proportion than you would normally expect.
But as you pointed out, perhaps a lot of those did not perish over there, but decided to stay over there.
Yeah.
Is that not?
No, well, I mean died. I mean like died. Maybe a third, probably a little bit less than that, 25%, somewhere in that range. But yeah. But and then of the remaining, say 66 to 75%, some maybe half of them came back to Alberta, half of them remained in Britain, and half of them. Okay. Like there was a good quote of someone who came back with a broken heart and then perished shortly thereafter. So, you know,
we shouldn't laugh. That's sad.
It is sad.
Why are we laughing? Poor guy.
Yeah.
Fell in love.
And then he left a wife and daughter behind who decided a couple of years later in the midst of the Depression, I think, decided to sell the ranch and try to make it on their own. So.
Wow.
So that's an interesting story. I need to do a bit more on it. But yeah.
It's an interesting story, and it's something that I was not overly familiar with before you came. So if we'll sort of move on then to the next step, now that we have people who are enlisted in the war, we have people who want to get out of the war. And Jordan, that's what you were talking about in your presentation. You were talking about soldiers who had self-inflicted wounds as a means of escaping the front lines. And now before we sort of delve into this a little bit, a similar sort of definition question is what classifies as a self-inflicted wound? Because you had some interesting discussion of this, that it's not just guys shooting themselves in the foot.
Right.
So what was it?
Well, essentially, it's similar to the remittance man. I mean, the definition itself is rather fluid. So in the Canadian context, a self-inflicted wound is sort of understood the same way it is in the British context. But essentially a self-inflicted wound is just how you injure yourself on purpose, or you can induce sickness, for instance. But usually it is seen as a physical wound that you give to yourself, usually seen as a way to escape the war in a purposeful manner. But the British Army, this became a problem by about 1916. The British Army started making decrees that the definition itself would be rather much broader than it was originally initiated as. So in 1916, the British Army decreed that venereal disease, for instance, would be considered a self-inflicted wound, as well as trench foot would be considered a self-inflicted wound, as well as if you were caught in a gas attack and you were suffering from the effects of gas poisoning, but you did not have your gas mask with you, your small box respirator, then that would also be considered a self-inflicted wound. So self-inflicted wound is not only a soldier making a decision to wound themselves, it is also can also classify people who are becoming casualties due to negligence, carelessness, or disobeying of orders. So it's a rather broad definition, and it's more about sort of trying to keep discipline and morale in the army rather than actually dealing with the physical or psychological needs of the soldiers themselves.
Does it not also make it simple for those in authority to try and, so that they don't have to determine accidental wounds? Like you talked about, if I'm cleaning my gun and it goes off, that's an accident, and you can't say that I've shot myself in the foot because I want to leave. It's a legitimate accident. But if you have this definition to say anything that would be considered careless, we're classifying as a self-inflicted wound, then that avenue towards punishment is there. And there's no ambiguity in it. Right? Is that not just a simple measure for those in authority who are on the front lines, and they don't have to take their time to try and determine if it was an accident or on purpose?
I mean, most people in the literature, it's broken down usually as willful versus accidental self-inflicted wounds. So the example of the soldier who shoots himself in the foot due to carelessness or negligence, any act of carelessness or negligence or disobeying of orders is not necessarily a self-inflicted wound, right? So essentially, it's if you become a casualty, and that's important for the Army because it means, in all likelihood, you can no longer continue to fight, at least for a short period of time. So that compromises the ability of your unit to attain its objectives, hold the line, whatever. So because that is seen as a problem, that's why we see the definition sort of expanding to all these manner of different sort of ways to become a casualty, right? Rather than enemy action. So, I mean, friendly fire, for instance, is not considered a self-inflicted wound unless it was purposeful. So if you ask your friend to shoot you in the foot, that would certainly be a self-inflicted wound. Sure. But if you happen to get shrapnel from artillery and it was your own artillery, then, I mean, that's just a combat wound that is treated as such. So,
well, who makes the call? I think you mentioned that in your presentation, but like, who's actually doing the deciding as to whether or not this was willful or not?
Obviously, the British High Command sort of has this definition, but it's all about the people on the ground. So it's the medical and military authorities that are actually at the front who are sort of determining whether this wound is, it was, predetermined or whatever. So if there is suspicion or evidence that perhaps something is a bit fishy about it, then that medical officer has a duty to report to his superior. But yeah, it was mostly the guys on the ground, and there was also a little bit of wiggle room in terms of leniency or discretion for the officers. Now, later on in the war, the British Army tried to stamp that out by, issuing decrees that any suspicion of self-inflicted wounds must be reported to superiors. Otherwise, that officer himself could be reprimanded for not following orders and bringing it up the chain of command. So, I mean, it's a complex issue, but...
Now, the motivation for doing it, is it as simple as I want to get out of the front lines? I can't deal with this trench anymore. I got to get out of here. I'm shooting myself in the foot, or I'm doing whatever. I'm going to the brothel to try and get venereal to see. Like, is it that simple of just guys trying to escape this, or is there a deeper meaning to it?
Well, in the literature, in the Canadian historiography, essentially the argument went that the people who resorted to these wounds were those that were not great soldiers to begin with. Their combat motivation, their morale, their discipline is already questionable. They refer to them as the bad apples or the shirkers or the cowards. And so that was sort of the dominant interpretation for a long time. But now, from my own research and from first-hand accounts and archival sources, it becomes clear that this phenomenon sort of emerges where every indication is that soldier is a good soldier. He's expressing camaraderie and loyalty to his unit. Perhaps he is a volunteer, so he believes in the cause. And even during, after August 18, when the tide has turned, we're still getting examples of men who are committing self-inflicted wounds. So this just sort of leads to the question of, everything seems to be going right, so why would someone do something that could potentially kill them or make them lose their pension or get stigmatized as a coward? Why would they risk that during a relatively good time during the war? And so that just sort of leads me to further research, and then the conclusion is essentially that this is not men who are unwilling to continue, but rather men who are unable to continue. So this is where we get shell shock and PTSD, and obviously other extreme cases as well. So when I first did my research here, I was tying self-inflicted wounds up with suicide as sort of two sides of the same coin, suicide merely being one step further to permanently take yourself away from the suffering or the trauma or whatever. So that's sort of, I interpret it as essentially the actions of a desperate soldier, someone who cannot escape the frontline service any other way, legally or nobly, so they resort to something that is considered a crime, simply because they can't handle it, and if they continue, they might break down in combat, which could compromise their unit and, create more casualties or, make an opening for a trench raid or something. So the idea there is just, they can't handle it anymore. We all have our breaking points. So
you mentioned the historiography looking at these guys as not the best soldiers, and you talk about how some of the people who had self-inflicted wounds had very good records.
Exactly.
As soldiers. One of the things I'm wondering is perhaps does the historiography look at them in this way because it hurts the narrative of Canada being this great force and Canadian soldiers being the best in the war, and having guys who do this hurts that.
I mean, that's exactly it, and that I actually failed to mention that in my presentation, but that was sort of my starting point, was the reason why they're interpreted as shirkers, bad apples, cowards, feminine, whatever. The reasons why they're interpreted that way in the historiography is because that serves to, if you call a spade and you say that, hey, wait a minute, good loyal soldiers were doing this as well, just like you said, this undermines sort of the dominant narrative of Canadian exceptionalism, colony to nation thesis, and it undermines sort of the nationalist thesis that Canadian soldiers were different.
We were better fighters.
Exactly, the frontier. We were the shock troops of the British Empire. Mm-hmm. So if we sort of tell it as it is and interpret it as, hey, maybe we weren't the best, and there's examples of looting, killing of prisoners. All of these things sort of call into question those dominant narratives that are really still supported today, even in academic history. My supervisor at the University of Calgary essentially referred to it as cheerleading or heavy lifting for nationalism. Mm. So for me, that was my starting point, was I want to show it as objectively as possible. And also, I determined that was not disrespecting the honor of those soldiers or of the Canadian Corps. If anything, that was giving them more honor and respect, because you acknowledge the hardships that they're up against. You acknowledge the actual trauma, the pain, the physical, psychological, emotional sort of trauma that they're experiencing, and that most of them did go through. Mm-hmm. Most of them did not commit a self-inflicted wound. Most of them did not kill themselves. Right. Most of them did not desert. So just to show that the army stayed together, there was no major mutinies in the field during in the Canadian Corps. So
there were some major mutinies outside of it.
I mean, after there were certainly in England. And
Ryan, you've written about mutinies before.
I like mutinies are fun because the soldiers finally go, no more of this. We're taking over.
But it's curious because it's after the war where those major instances are happening in Canada.
There's lots of little mutinies around in training, but you're right. There's no mutinies in the field, right? Like they'll kick about the poor food and for the thing that I found in my research on mutinies is it's always about the hypocrisy. It's always about these guys, my sergeants, my NCOs, my officers are getting this, and I'm not, right. And it's not fair, and I'm a free citizen volunteer, usually pre-1917 anyways, and I'm not having any more of it, so I'm not showing up for parade, right? Whereas once you get to the field, it's implicitly fair. Somebody said today the democracy of death.
Yeah, the democratization of death or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, which is a good segue.
Historian John Gillis.
Actually, before we get into death, one more. I do have another question. But you're talking about, okay, so with mutinies, with guys self-inflicted wounds, they're good soldiers, you're saying, who get fed up. But surely to goodness, there are guys who get there and say, screw this. I mean, I'm not doing that. And in the first 5 minutes they're there, are doing stuff. So, I mean, there has to be some level of nuance there to say that there are going to be bad apples in a group that big, right?
Right.
And so, but how can you distinguish between those cases? What's the methodology to trying to find those guys?
Right. I mean, essentially for me to determine, if we were going to simplify and put it into category A or category B, good soldiers versus bad soldiers, one of the ways you determine that is you just look at the writings. How did these guys approach the war? So for me, I went through obviously letters and memoirs and all that good stuff. And there are very telltale signs. If they're a good soldier, they're talking about, things are not great here, but I'm going to do my duty for king and country. Or I will stay loyal unto the end. Or, the food is shitty, but the guys are great, and we're going to stick it out to the end. So you get all these little phrases about Sure, yeah.
Well, I can't remember the name of the guy. Dave Bergson wrote a book about him, but he became a Minister of National Defense eventually, but he started
Claxton?
out... Yeah, Brooke Claxton. In his book, in his memoir, he talks about hauling an artillery piece up the line, and he says, I saw a British artillery piece that had fallen off, and all the gunners were just sitting around smoking cigarettes and waiting. And then later on up the line, I saw a Canadian artillery piece that had fallen off the road in much the same way, and the Canadians stopped everybody, got a group of guys together from the road and said, all right, let's do this, let's push this out, and carried on. It's sort of like that can-do attitude. And that's actually mentioned in the Second World War context as well. Right. Monty said that about the First Canadian Army prior to D-Day. He said they just look like nice fellas, essentially.
I think that's a good point, but again, I think we got to be careful of the slippery slope towards the Canadian exceptionalism, right? And certainly every unit, every big group of people is going to have some good people and some bad. And I think it's important that you sort of pointed out that nuance there, and it's just sort of trying to identify the reasons why someone might do that.
Right.
And the dominant narrative is that the people who did that were, we probably don't want them in the army anyway, but the evidence suggests otherwise. And I think that it's time for this shift in sort of the literature to move away from we are the best soldiers and move towards, things were pretty shitty for them too, and they had a lot of hardships to go up against, and what was the actual effect of combat on individuals. So that's sort of where I was trying to go with it.
But as far as Canadian exceptionalism goes, I mean, you got to admit the last 100 days. I mean, sure, we started off pretty bad, but by the end of the war, that was an effective fighting formation, and you can give all sorts of reasons for that, and there are quite a few just simple reasons. They had more troops in their corps,
more men per
and you
battalion.
take less casualties if you have more troops. So, like overall, we had a good training system. We were very effectively led by people who learned their trade not in Africa but in France. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons that you can point to,
of course.
But I mean, it doesn't change the fact that at least in the First World War, Canadians were pretty friggin' awesome.
I mean, there's no question that Canadian Corps punched above its weight in the latter half of the First World War. There's no question about that. I'm just saying, let's not get carried away here. The Canadian Corps, at its height had, 160,000 men fighting men. So, I mean, I have a German friend who always he makes fun of me. Oh, that's pretty cute, the Canadian Corps. we had 3.5 million men in uniform. So, I mean, it's just we got to keep it in perspective. But certainly, the Canadian Corps certainly was something, if not to be proud about, at least to sort of acknowledge that how are these guys able to be so successful?
Now, just one final question is, Dan Pellerin asked this question to you yesterday in the session. I thought it was really interesting. If the point of a self-inflicted wound is to get yourself off the front line, then a punishment doesn't do anything to discourage you from doing this because you're still going to get off the line. So how did the Canadian Corps or the British Corps, whoever was in charge of specific soldiers at any given time, how did they try to dissuade people from committing these self-inflicted wounds?
Right. So, I mean, I think that's a really crucial point, that usually the prospect of punishment or the acknowledgement that a crime will be punished, it doesn't actually deter people, right? If you want to get out of the wound, if you want to get out of the war, you're going to do it one way or the other. Yeah. But in terms of sort of maintaining morale or discipline, there's any number of things that they did. Part of it was simply treating them like human beings. So rather than sort of treating them as just a piece, a cog in this vast machine where they have no control, ensure that they have their rum ration, ensure that their food is there on time, make sure their water is clean, make sure those letters and parcels from home are getting there. And then there's also, of course, appeals to patriotism. If you're not going to do it for yourself, do it for the country, do it for your family. So calls to loyalty. Camaraderie is another big one. And we see this, I saw it emerging in firsthand accounts over and over and over again. Soldiers would say, I can't stick it out any longer. I'm going to have a breakdown, but I don't want to let the guys down. I can't let the 13th Battalion down because I've been with them from the beginning and there's a lot of pride and loyalty there. Aside from that, maintaining morale, it's just sort of the basic things that you would think of. Making sure that they have time away from the front. Making sure they can get a good meal and maybe a couple beers from time to time. A shower or a bath is a big one. Leave to England is the ultimate. And spirituality, religion, these things keep people going. Superstition is another big one. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Tim Cook's chapter on superstition. So it's just these little things that keep people going, and if you can sort of keep them distracted, then they're able to sort of perhaps lose themselves in the moment and remember that this is for something bigger. But as the Canadian Corps advances, especially into the 100 days, the nature, pace, and intensity of the fighting gets to the point where there is very little opportunity for that respite, either physically, away from the lines, or psychologically. So if you're always in combat, if you know you're going to be going tomorrow, and then you're going to be going the day after, there's no respite. So you can't sort of get that time to heal yourself psychologically. So, and then it's cumulative, and then it gets to the boiling point, and then we see desertion, AWOL, self-inflicted wounds, suicide. And then we also see other examples of insubordination or indiscipline. So there's lots of accounts of soldiers going to ground, for example, during an attack. So instead of continuing on, they will take cover in a shell hole and they will refuse to move. So we see that. Or conversely, instead of staying put, we see soldiers retreating without orders. So I mean, these are sort of examples of not only men being pushed to the breaking point, but also discipline slipping. And that's sort of where I wanted to go with this, is it's about discipline and morale, combat motivation, and these are compromised by the fighting. And it's just, we have to sort of put it into perspective there.
Now, I guess one thing, here's where I'm going to try and segue. One thing that happens when fighting increases, discipline decreases, more people are going to die. and the reality is that when people die, you have to do something with their bodies. And this is, Jeremy, where your research comes in. And you study burial policy.
That's correct.
During the First World War. Now, I guess the obvious question that I will ask is, why?
Well, why not? When I started looking at it, I became interested in, okay, well, what happened with the body after the war? What did we do with the body? How was it treated? What did we do for missing? And so I got really interested in this topic of just looking at all the policies that surrounded what happened to the body after the war and how it was dealt with. And one thing I came across was that really at the start of the war, there was no policy. Now, I shouldn't say there was no policy. It's not really fair to say that. You have people like Sir Fabian Ware, who, with the mobile ambulance units, he starts creating the graves registration as adding it as a mandate to the mobile ambulance. So to say that there was absolutely no policy wouldn't be fair in contrast. Right. But it didn't really gain official recognition until closer to 1915 as well. So at the start of the war, you're not seeing a whole lot of stuff happening. So it's a complete, I wouldn't say a disaster, but there's no coherent policy going on at the time.
Which I find really strange, because this isn't the first time that Canadians have gone off and fought in a war. Certainly not the first time the British have been in a war. They should be aware that they have to do something with these bodies. Why is there no policy?
Well, I think what it is with the First World War, it's the magnitude of it. So you have these earlier wars, which, you have your Boer War,
colonial wars,
list goes on. But the First World War is the first one where it was a complete new proportion of war. And with the amount of bodies that were actually present that were killed from the war, it also changed warfare. So you couldn't just rush up to a trench and try and take a trench. You had to actually change your strategies. The invention of the machine gun completely changed that as well. So earlier on, I think it was more that they had to completely change what little policy they had before, because you deal with a couple dead here or there, you bury it, fine, no problem. But now all of a sudden you have a full battlefield of, say, 10,000, 15,000 dead from a day a week. Now we have to do something, and we have to do something now, and we have to completely change what we've done before. And I think it just adds into that the First World War blowing war out of proportion and changing everything.
So these guys are confronted with all these dead bodies, and you talked about how the over time things sort of changed.
Yeah,
in terms of how these bodies were going to be dealt with, and how in a lot of cases it was the soldiers themselves initially who are left with these bodies, who are trying to do something with them. So what was sort of the initial process of guys who survived a battle and now they have their comrades who are dead? What was their initial reaction to this, and how did those guys try to deal with it?
Well, one anecdote that I'll give was one with, I'll call it Hettridge and Dyer. I can't remember their ranks off the top of my head, but they're from the Divisional Command. And there's a body of, now I found reports that said that it was an airman, but I don't actually know for sure what rank the body was. but they actually went out it was still during the battle. They went actually out into the line of fire to try and pull this body back. So a lot of cases, people go above and beyond to actually try and recover the body. I think it's a sense of camaraderie amongst these people, trying to actually, okay, let's give them this proper burial, and that way we can commemorate them after the war, not only for us, but for their family as well. Their family are going to want something to come back to and to see, and to actually be able to, oh, this is my son, this is my husband, he fought for the country, and this is where he lies now, and to actually be able to do that for the families as well.
Were they conscious, though, of what the policy was at the top level of the armed forces? Because especially early on, were these guys pulling bodies with the expectation that they would be sent back to their families and be buried in their hometowns? Or were they bringing them back to give them a burial right there and to be able to mark the spot and to know where it is and to write a letter to the family and say, this is where he is, or to a general and say, this is where he is, and this is where you can find him? Like, what is their mindset? Their
mindset's more of the latter. So they want to pull the body back. Now, earlier on in the war, you see a lot of temporary cemeteries which are closer to the line of battle. This actually changes as well, because with the cemeteries at the line of battle, you have high artillery is actually damaging the cemeteries. So later on throughout the war, they have temporary cemeteries that are back from the line, and then later on they reinter bodies in permanent cemeteries. So the idea is more for this, to actually be able to pull them back. Now, this wasn't entirely the case, though. There was examples where there was mass cemeteries and mass graves. It was actually a common practice in the British military to take a bunch of bodies and dump it into an old trench and just fill in the trench, and then try and figure it out after. So one anecdote I gave wasn't exactly, doesn't show, it shows one case of going above and beyond, whereas you also have these cases where, okay, throw everyone into the old trench, bury it up, and now we don't have to deal with the smell, and it's taken care of. There might be policies going on. Now, actually, this was written into the policy as well. In extreme cases, they could do this more so the morale didn't decrease on the front, but the smell was a big thing as well.
Yeah, and was this something the guys were trained to deal with?
Yes, you had what was called the Graves Registration Units, and they were attached to, you have the Graves Commission, and then you have the Director of Graves Registration and Inquiries, and they were attached to them. They were part of them, but they were attached to the units, and they were trained in a lot of this. But I think it was more of a crash course training as well. This is a new thing for them as well. So, this is where you see the policy throughout the war is evolving and changing, and sometimes it evolves forward, and sometimes it goes backwards too.
Now, you talked a lot in this presentation about the Imperial War Graves Commission.
Yeah.
Now, what exactly was their job, and how did they deal with some of these logistical problems of, like you said, we have cemeteries that are on the lines, and they're getting shot up by artillery. We have to move them back. I mean, exactly how did they approach their job, and what was their goal in trying to deal with these bodies?
Well, the IWGC, or the Imperial War Graves Commission, it didn't come in. It got really accepted in 1917, and the main job of it was more for maintenance of the cemeteries. But at the same time, too, you see, like you mentioned, cemeteries being shut up during the war. This was actually more earlier on before, but it's still changes going on, and I use that as an example to show changes that were going on before the existence of it. One thing that the IWGC actually strove to change was any favoritism that was shown towards officers versus NCOs. One example I found was that earlier on in the war, I'm just using this as one example, was a Lieutenant Colonel Strange, who he died, and they actually were waiting for soldiers to be pallbearers and not actually actively part of the war effort. And I found that really interesting, because you take a look at any NCOs, I hadn't found anything saying, even for gallantry, where, he was loved by all of his men, and so we're going to give him a military funeral. I really didn't see that a whole lot. So that's one thing they strove to change a lot, is, equality amongst death. Another thing, too, was, and this was actually a question I got asked in my presentation yesterday, was there any, for gallantry, was there any special treatment for soldiers who were seen as gallant? I actually found stuff the other way, where soldiers who were deemed as cowards, before the IWGC, you have the graves as cowards were actually segregated from the rest of the soldiers, because they were deemed as, not as great soldiers, poor soldiers,
don't
deserve to be buried with people who died an honorable death. This is more of a dishonorable death, and with that, you see a quick change going on there, where they're all of a sudden re-put into normal graves at the time. So
he wasn't too cowardly to die, so he can lie with everybody else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that the IWGC, they stepped strongly on this was repatriation. Throughout the war, there was an ad hoc policy of not repatriating the bodies. Now, this happened in 1914. You could actually have, if your family was very prominent and you died in the war, they could actually pay to have your body brought back to Canada. The military stopped this really quickly. I believe I didn't find any records of it past 1914. I think it's more of logistics issues because you're starting to, even into 1915, you're realizing this isn't just over by Christmas. This is going to be going on. This could be going on for a while as well. So you're going to have logistical problems where we don't want to bring it back. I found examples where families could buy special crosses or actually buy coffins for their soldiers. It led to problems where crosses were multiple designs, multiple sizes, and they wanted uniformity. So that's why the Commonwealth War Graves actually, they standardized a lot of this and created standard crosses. They actually did away with coffins, I think more to do with logistics issues at the time, because after the war they actually bring coffins back in as well. And so you see, the IWGC gives a lot of standardization of the policies.
That's one thing that people always say when they go to a military cemetery is how uniform everything is. And I've only ever been to the one in Arlington, Virginia. I've never been to any of the ones in Europe. But it's really quite remarkable to just see the crosses just forever, and they're all in perfect rows. It's really quite remarkable. And it speaks to I think there's a larger symbolism other than just to the soldiers who have died. It's part of what the military is, right? There's this notion of standardization, of uniformity in the military, and that's really reflected in these cemeteries. And is that a conscious decision on their part to reflect this for the soldiers who are still alive and say, even in death, you're part of this unit and it's not going away?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the situation underneath the ground is not uniform. It's not like they dug one hole, they put one guy into it, they filled in the hole, they put the one cross there, right? I thought that it was kind of, at least in the First World War context, they kind of just threw everybody in and buried it over and then very carefully planted the crosses. And I imagine it'd be different in every case, but is that true? Or
one example, some of the pictures actually from my presentation from yesterday actually showed that, where you just have literally, it looks like the trench, but it's not as deep, and basically you can tell it's for burials, and they have the bodies are all lined up, they're not perfect or anything, and then they strategically, they would put the cross at, and that's what I found of that. Now, to go back to your point of uniformity of crosses, it's kind of taboo to talk about, but they're not. There's some that actually aren't. You'll have some that, they're perfectly aligned, and all of a sudden you'll have three that are very close. And actually, Ryan and I were talking about this yesterday, and it's where they know that soldiers are actually, we know that these three guys are actually in here. We don't know what parts of them are where, so they put the crosses or the headstones right side by side, very, very close, and they squash them together because it's still commemorating that, we know they're in here, but we really don't know where. We really don't want to talk about this either.
Yeah. I would like to say something about this. It's just, I would use the example of Tynecott Cemetery in France, I suppose? Anyway, I think it's the largest British Commonwealth war cemetery in the world. And we were talking about uniformity, but I think one of the most powerful aspects of these cemeteries is that there are elements of both collective and individual. So when you arrive there, it's all you see is a field of either white headstones or white crosses, so you sort of lose the individual aspect. It's just a field of numbers, just you sort of get lost there. But then you go up to the headstone itself, and if they have identification on it, you can see that individual soldier. You can see when they were born, see when they died, see what their name was, see if there was an inscription by a loved one. And so I think it's sort of the interplay between collective and individual that makes a lot of these cemeteries so powerful.
But is that not exactly what a soldier is when he's marching in formation? That from afar you see the collective,
right,
and then you can walk up to that soldier and there's an individual story there. So in death, the representation of him in death is the same as him alive.
Well, that would only work for soldiers who you actually know who's actually buried there. Then now you have the soldiers who aren't known who's buried there, and you have the known unto God. So yes, I agree with that for soldiers who are known, but no, that's not entirely the case as well with those who aren't.
The other thing I find studying military history is it's really easy to forget that you're talking about individuals that died.
Right.
Because, Like, I'm reading Stacy's official history right now, and it's like, oh, and there were 7,200 Canadian casualties,
Exactly.
after D-Day, and it's like, oh, well, that's a big number, and then you carry on.
Right.
But when I was in Sicily, we did a battlefield tour and went through all the battlefields, and then we went to a cemetery, and it was like, I love military history, obviously, and I was like, neat, this is cool. Like, there's where the Germans were, and there's where the Canadians were, and there's how they scaled that cliff that Farley Mullet wrote about, or whatever. And then you get to the gravestone or the graveyard, cemetery, and go, oh well, that's the actual like cost of this, like that's the cost in humans. So,
and that's something that we've talked about on the show before. I think with Marcia Skripik is that we get in history desensitized a lot, and so it's this notion then that we can talk about a cemetery, and a cemetery. And the graves in there, yes. But as soon as you start to talk about one guy and his story, that resonates more for some reason with people. Because it's individualized. It's not this number that is almost meaningless. It's that here's a real person, here's a real story. And I'm wondering if for you then, Jeremy, is in doing this research, do you find yourself, when you come across these anecdotes of individual guys, that there's more meaning, personal meaning to you, in those stories than there is in studying the larger policy?
Oh, most definitely. That's why one reason why I always go back to the Hettridge and Dyer, and one reason I can even remember their names too, is it just really resonated with me. I put myself in the same situation, and I asked myself, would I do the same thing? You can never actually answer that until you're in the situation. I like to think yes, but that kind of anecdote really stuck with me just because of that.
And I don't know, did you guys find the same thing, that you get desensitized sometimes to the mass numbers, and then when you find individual stories, it sort of remind you of the humanity of the whole thing?
Well, I mean, when you talk about the mass numbers, right? For me, like, the question that just jumped into my mind is it really a tragedy? I mean, sure, it's sad that these guys died fighting for freedom and everything else, but they knew what they were getting into. In most cases, they were volunteers, at least in the Canadian example. I mean, if you were Russian during the Second World War, well, too bad, so sad. But, I mean, is it tragic that they died, or is it expected, or is it less tragic than if they'd had a heart attack on their farm in Alberta in 1914, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that comes across as how the families receive that as well. So certainly there are bereaved, grieving families back in Canada that my son, my brother, whatever, died. But then you also see the patriotic aspect, right? So these mothers are proud that they had 2 sons or 3 sons, or that one example I saw where the mother had 8 sons.
Jonathan Vance loves that example, yeah.
And they all went off and they all died. And for them, that is a point of pride. Our family is more loyal, or our family is more patriotic because we gave more to the defense of the empire.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's almost how it's received as well. You got to tie that in as well, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Also, if whoever's listening to this on the internet wants to go to my Twitter feed and go through, there's a poem by Anna McDowell or something that I posted a link to that totally fits this, because it talks about how this woman raises her son up and hoards her gold with, like, gnarled fingers or something. It's a very evocative thing. I'm not doing it justice. Go to Twitter and you can find it. But and then all that she gets in return is tears, right? Like, she sends her son off, and that's that. So, but that's sort of the counterpoint to what you're saying, because there is simultaneously this patriotic, I gave a son, and it was worth it. I mean,
but I mean, at the end of the day, there's that empty bedroom.
Yeah.
There's, it's a little bit quieter at night. You don't hear them playing. You're still missing a family member, and I mean, that's death hits home. Like Ryan said, if it's a heart attack, or if it's he fought and died for his country, death is death. So
yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, you're still missing that son, brother, whatever.
It's like that scene in Oh, What a Lovely War. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie, but there's the scene where they do this big song and dance of the recruiting, and then it's this lady kind of pushes her son up onto the stage, and he joins up, and then they're singing and they're dancing. He puts on a uniform, and he gets on the train, and then the train leaves, and everything's happy, and then all of a sudden all the people leave, and it's just this mom standing at the train station looking at nothing in dead silence. And I feel like that really sort of evokes what it would have been like, just that silence to have, it's all fun and games when the songs are playing. But
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, well, there's a movie too. I think it's called The Fighting Sullivans. It's a World War. It's about the Second World War. I think it was released during the war. It's an American movie, and it's a family who has 5 sons. I think it's 5, all of whom go and fight and die. And the movie ends, spoiler alert, the movie ends with the parents being invited to, what is it called when you break a bottle on the ship?
Christen.
To christen an aircraft carrier, an American aircraft carrier. And so they christen it, and they say this is the Sullivans, or the SS Sullivan. And it pans out to the sky, and you see the sons all there in their uniforms. Like they're dead.
Like silhouette.
In the sky. And it's this weird imagery of, you know what, the name is going to live on, and their legacy is going to live on with this ship, but they're dead, and their parents are sort of left now to confront this world without their children. And it's this really interesting dynamic of there's the pride with the sadness, and how does it all sort of play together? And that's probably something that can only be dealt with like individually. Like there's no way to say, to make any sort of mass statement about this is how people dealt with it, because I think it's such an individual thing.
Well, you could write a book about it called Death So Noble, perhaps, which might involve a grad student reading it and then deciding to come to the University of Western Ontario to study it.
That may or may not happen. Yeah, no, but even in there, I think he's nuanced about it and acknowledging the individual aspect of it and saying, you know what, even with things like memorials in individual towns, yes, there's a town pride to it, but the way in which people are going to interact with it is so individual.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? No two people are going to have the same emotional connection to that.
Exactly.
It just depends on what their experience is. Yeah. And that's what I really find interesting about this sort of stuff, the stuff with death. And I've read way too much about death in my life, but it's a really interesting topic, and the way in which we deal with death and all that. And it's interesting, and then to put that into the practical part of it, of, you know, when people die, like when I die, I'm me, like the consciousness of me is gone, right? I don't have to worry. Well, at the very least, it's gone in this world. I'm not going to have to worry about cleaning out my house or dealing with my body, right? And that's the practical part of death that I think so often gets overlooked. As we look at the emotional part of it, and yet here's a very practical thing of here's a lot of people who are dead. We have to do something with it, and I think it's really interesting that you've chosen to study it. Probably not the most uplifting thing in the world to study, but
okay, just wait till looking at the Korean War and burial policy during then.
Okay. Now, before we leave, we have a few minutes here. The whole commemorations of the First World War will be starting very, very soon. As we're recording this, I think it was a couple days ago that Jack Granstein had an op-ed in the Globe and Mail wondering why Canada isn't properly commemorating the First World War. You can Google it and read it, and you can make your own conclusions on that particular piece. But I'm wondering what you guys think as people who study the First World War and who are in military history at a very strong military history institution, what your thoughts are on issues of commemoration of the First World War and how Canadians should approach the anniversary of the outbreak of the start of the war as it approaches here.
So I was looking at my watch because I was seeing how close it was to August, because I can tell that on my watch apparently. The war hasn't started yet, so I think it's a bit.
But they're revving up for it.
Yeah, it's like 99 in 6 months or something like that. But so you can't really get mad at whoever you get mad at for not doing a good job on the centenary when the centenary hasn't yet arrived. I mean, we've still got Vimy, we've still got the Somme, we've still got Second Heat. We've got a whole bunch of dates coming up that are going to require that 100-year thing. Plus, I kind of think it's arbitrary. I don't know about you guys, but it's like, humans have 10 fingers, and there's been 10 of those, so we've got to do something about it, you know? I don't know.
I think it all ties back into sort of the nation-building thing. I mean, you can say what you want about sort of the Conservative government and their agenda in terms of reformulating Canadian identity more along militaristic lines, but if the object of these commemorations and these centenary celebrations is to act as a unifying force and sort of to make Canadians look back and say we have a strong military heritage and we need to continue to support our troops now, if that is sort of the goal, or if there is that sort of underlying motive, then I think it is completely misguided, personally. But
you guys want to be part of it? Like, you say that part of it's misguided, then do you want to be part of a process to adjust the way in which it's being commemorated?
I think
or do you want to disassociate yourself from the process?
No, I think that would be a wrong way of doing it as well. I think it just has to be more of a dialogue between academics like ourselves, the public, public historians, museum curators. I think it has to be a more collaborative effort. And I'm not that well versed in sort of the actual celebrations, but I could imagine there could be a little bit more collaboration between people either who grew up, like old people today who have a father who fought, or there's a ways to do it that makes it more inclusive, rather than just sort of, this is how we were going to commemorate the war, and you guys should all take part because you're Canadians and you're loyal. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just more of a dialogue that needs to be taking place between, in my humble opinion, people who know something about the war and, people who are going to be setting those policies.
Mm-hmm. Patrick O'Brien, who wrote the Master Commander series, said that the reason that he wrote about the Napoleonic Wars was because that was Britain's Trojan tale. Like, that's their sort of foundational kind of badass, this is us fighting the evil enemy and doing it, and
Nelson
sort of
and
all that stuff, right? I think that Canada's Trojan tale is the First World War, right? Like, that's really when we stop being Britain and start being something new. Or not. It's hard to say, really. But nevertheless, I think that the focus has certainly been placed on that as sort of our foundational,
the definitive event,
event in our history, and rightfully so. I mean, that's why I like to look at it, because it's an impressive thing that happened. So I mean, as someone who's chosen to spend a lot of time doing this, I'd be interested in becoming part of the centenary celebration.
Commemoration, I think, is probably the better.
Well, we're gonna have 4 years of it.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
But I mean, what I'd really like more than anything else is a solid Canadian movie about the First World War. Passchendaele did not meet my expectations of awesomeness, and to put it mildly. And 21 Brothers was pretty cool, but you need more than a budget of like $4,000. No offense, he did a great job on a very small budget, but. There hasn't been a good Canadian war film. I think that if I could do one thing, if I was Stephen Harper for a day, I would say I'm going to invest a bunch of money in making a decent Canadian First World War flick.
Something that is realistic, as well as something that perhaps Canadians can be proud of, or at least sort of acknowledge the heroism of our past soldiers or whatever.
All right, well, there you have it. I appreciate you guys being here and coming to the conference. It was a very enjoyable experience for us here at the University of Ottawa. Hopefully you guys enjoyed your trek down to Ottawa, and we're glad you were here. And I know, Ryan, you're going to do some research while you're here, which I think is one of the draws of this conference, is that it's in the nation's capital, right down the road from Library and Archives Canada, so it gives you that opportunity as well. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. Ryan Flavelle, Jordan Chase, Jeremy Garrett, all from the University of Western Ontario. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for him.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.